Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Appleton, and I am a graduate assistant from GSU for the Atlanta Beltline Partnership. Welcome to the second installment in our new Atlanta Beltline Partnership Health Lecture Series. We are partnering with Georgia State University to provide you with informational lectures covering a diverse range of health and fitness related topics. Today, our guest lecturer is Pete Rohleder, who will be talking about why strength training is important. Pete completed his master's degree in exercise science from Wichita State University and has been a certified strength and conditioning specialist since 2011. Over the past 17 years, he's helped thousands achieve their health, fitness, and performance goals. Pete is currently a clinical instructor and the program coordinator for the Undergraduate Exercise Science Program at GSU. He is also the host of the More to Movement podcast. Pete is passionate about the science behind movement to enhance training outcomes and improve movement discrepancies. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation. Please feel free to submit your questions into the chat box. I will monitor it and relay the questions to Pete. Without further ado, I give you Pete Rohleder.
Thank you, Sarah. That was a very nice introduction. And thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to be here. And I have some great things to talk about today. And so also want to say that I'm usually really interactive with these kinds of things. So there's going to be a few times that I'm going to ask you to prompt something in the chat. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, that's totally fine. But I'm going to invite you to kind of participate with some of the questions that I may ask, because I'd love to get a feel for where you guys are at. All right. And like the intro said, I'm here to talk to you a little bit today about strength training and why it's important. And we're going to hopefully give you guys some great takeaways that can really impact your efforts. And so the two things that I'm going to focus on today are the benefits of strength training, but then also some of the modalities and the principles that will help you get the most out of your efforts, because that's the big takeaway right there. And the first thing I want to ask is, and if you can drop it in the chat, that'd be great. I want to know if you are currently strength training or you have strength training. So if you are or you have, you can drop a yes in the chat. And if you haven't, you can just simply put no. And if you don't feel comfortable, that's fine. I'd love to get a feel for how many are actually engaged in strength training. I'm getting a lot of yeses right now. That's awesome. Some no's. That's awesome. That's totally fine. It's awesome to see so many people here. Awesome. Thank you for being here, guys. So a lot of yeses. We have some no's, and that's fine. That's totally great. My goal today is to provide something for everybody. For those of you that are training, maybe take it to the next step. And for those of you that are not training right now, strength training right now, maybe getting some insight to help you take that step and start integrating some strength training protocols into what you're doing, all right? The reason I ask that is because for the last 17 years, I've been in the field, and there's been kind of this consensus. When I talk about strength training, I kind of there's this one visual that a lot of people have, and it's this. And this isn't bad. Right now, I'm going to put a disclaimer out there that this is not bad. This is not a bad thing. This is a great sub-community of the general concept of strength training. I participate in some of these, right? But this isn't the only thing strength training is. And when I ask most people what strength training is, these are the kind of visuals that I get. This is the kind of responses that I get. And I think this leads to kind of some physiological errors and some limiting mindsets. So if you look through this list here, I'm not going to read them all, but some of these may apply to you. And that's okay right now. But if you look at this list, most of these are A, either physiologically inaccurate, or B, can be modified if you train the right way, or if you make some modifications to the way that you strength train. And then thirdly, it's also approaching some of these barriers, these mindsets that prevent us from taking that step. And so hopefully today, the goal is to help you take some of those steps. And so the first thing I want to start with is just a general definition of what strength training is. Strength training, resistance training, weight training, really, it's all the same. They're all synonymous. It just kind of depends on what you're applying it to. But it all kind of conveys one thing, is that you are using resistance or load to generate and challenge muscle force, right? And we use muscle force in everything we do. If you get up and you walk around and you're picking things up or you're pushing things, we are applying muscle force. And so engaging in exercise that challenges that is extremely beneficial for all of us. And so that's why I say strength training is for everyone. We just got to find what works for you. We got to find the area or the niche that you feel comfortable in and where you can get the most from your efforts. So having said that, let's talk about first 4 pretty general benefits to strength training. And there's some of these aren't just the most apparent, the ones that you would automatically assume. This one is, number 1, improves bone, cartilage, tendon, and muscle health, which of course decreases the risk of injury. And now I'm not going to go crazy science mode on you guys, but I'm going to briefly talk about some of these real quick. When we apply force with load, with strength training, that load challenges the systems. So when we talk about bones, when a muscle pulls on a bone, that bone has to respond to that pull. And how it responds is adapting and increasing its density. So we can improve our bone density through strength training, which of course can decrease risk of injury and decrease the risk of diseases like osteoporosis. Of course, when we apply force to muscle and tendons and cartilage, we are improving the tensile strength of that tissue. So every time we challenge it, we improve it. And of course, when we improve it, it helps decrease the risk of injury. So that's benefit number 1, decrease of risk of injury, but then also improving the bone, cartilage, tendon, and muscle health. Number 2, disease prevention and improvement. Study after study is linking strength training to a decrease in some of the big diseases that we all are facing in the world. Cardiovascular disease, metabolic diseases such as diabetes, muscle pain, and even cancer, we're seeing improvements in from a consistent strength training regimen. So right there, if you're wanting to prevent or improve conditions, strength training is the way to go. Number 3, this one's a big one. I think a lot of people overlook. Strength training can improve mental health. And I don't know about you, but for me, a great stress reliever is to throw around a bunch of heavy weight. I love the strength train, obviously. That's why I'm lecturing on it, but there's more to it. One of the big things is something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. When we strength train, along with other exercise, we see an increase of this protein, and this protein helps impact the mood regulators. So the neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin. When those increase, we see a decrease in anxiety, we see a decrease in depression symptoms. Further, BDNF is also a stimulant for brain cell growth. So strength training has been linked to improvements in brain diseases like dementia. So again, we're looking at longevity here, that strength training is super impactful in improving mental health, but also preventing some of these diseases. 4th is improved performance. And this one's pretty straightforward, but it's kind of a summary of 1 through 3. That regardless of what your performance is, again, when I say performance, not just athletic performance or lifting heavy weights, but maybe ADLs or activities of daily living. What if you want to improve that? What if you want to have more independence, being able to move around on your own without the assistance of a cane or a walker? Strength training can improve that quality of life. And of course, it's by improving number 1, 2, and 3. And so improved performance is a very direct very direct correlation to strength training. And those are 4 really general benefits, but if that wasn't enough for you, I have a list here of all the things that research is linking strength training to improving. So I'm not going to read through this list, and I'm going to give you a moment to look through this list. But as you can see, strength training should be a vital and integral part to our lives because of all the things they improve. Obviously, it's just one piece of the puzzle. We have to have other elements of our life in order, absolutely. But strength training is one that many people avoid. And so we want to make sure that we're taking the steps to find a way to add it to our daily life. So we have some benefits. And that's great. Having some knowledge is awesome. And you've heard knowledge is power. I love that saying, but I like to take it a step further, that knowledge acquired then applied is power, right? And I think that's the next step here is all right, We know that it's beneficial. I know I got to do something. What should I do? And I've been in the field for 17 years, but I've also been training since I was 12. And so many more years than that. And I can tell you that I'm very comfortable with resistance training, strength training, but I can tell you that sometimes when I walk into a facility, I still get overwhelmed. It reminds me of a carnival. Like I'm all about visuals, everybody. So, when you walk into a carnival, you're kind of overwhelmed. It's like there's 1,000 things that you can do. It's like, I want to do that, and I want to do this, and oh, that looks like fun. What should I do? And you kind of wander. It's really easy to fall into that at a gym or a facility. And so let's talk briefly about some of the modalities or the types of resistance training that you can engage in. I'll talk about some of the pros and cons for each, and then you can kind of find what might work for you or what kind of inspires you a little bit. So when you talk about modalities or types of resistance training, this is usually the first thing that comes to mind. The selectorized equipment, and of course, these are great. There's a lot of pros and cons to all the things I'm going to present here. But this is the most common when you think of resistance training or strength training. And these selectorized machines are great. The selectorized machines allow you to have a little more stability, typically safer because you are in this machine. They're easy. They're selectorized, meaning that you get to select your weight. There's no plate loading, anything like that. One of the cons, though, is that they're typically one plane. Now, there's some great machines now that are full body, things like that, but typically they're a bit restrictive when we talk about something called movement patterns or your functional movement patterns. Sometimes machines can be restrictive. So if this is not your cup of tea, there's so many other options, and I'm going to talk about those briefly. There is something for everyone. And so the first one I'll talk about are free weights. Free weights typically are barbells or dumbbells pictured here. These have a lot of freedom. They're not restricted in any way. Of course, there's a risk of injury because there is more stability on your end, right? The machine itself is not providing stability, you are, which again is not only, that is a risk, but it's also part of the benefit. That's very important because now you're developing stabilizers at the joints that you may not get with other modalities. Kettlebells are another form of free weight. What's unique about a kettlebell is the weight distribution. So you have a handle and then you have the weight below. This allows the movements to be a little bit more dynamic. So you can add some more dynamic movements to your regimen that you may not be able to do with a dumbbell or a barbell. Now, the dumbbells or barbells are obviously still dynamic, but typically require a lot of skilled movement. And those are things like Olympic lifts, things like that. A great way to introduce some of those more dynamic movements would be kettlebells. The next one is medicine balls or something like that. Medicine balls are just a heavy weighted ball. These are great for integrating like functional movements because you can hold them and you can position them in different places and you can do some of your functional type of movements or the movements that you would do for your activities of daily living, anything from squatting to pressing, things like that. And this weighted ball adds some resistance to that. My favorite are these next two. Calisthenics or body weight, and then of course, resistance tubing or resistance bands. With the calisthenics or body weight, you don't need any equipment. So obviously, all of these things have a cost if you want to purchase them. And of course, the gym membership is an option. And of course, if you want to buy machines, I mean, those are several thousands of dollars. So question I usually get is, can I still have strength training gains from just body weight? Absolutely, you can. If you know how to apply it the right way and how to train it the right way so that your body responds. We'll get to that in just a moment. But you are only limited by your creativity when it comes to body weight training. There are so many different modalities just within body weight training that you can challenge the system and challenge the body. Resistance bands are another great way. They're very affordable and they're very versatile. What's unique about resistance bands is that they have resistance both through the up and down movements, concentric, eccentric movements. So the up and down movements, which is unique because with like free weights, typically you have that resistance when you're opposing gravity. So going against, going up typically, but then you have to kind of resist gravity down. Well, the resistance band offers resistance in both directions. And let me give you just a little personal anecdote. When I moved to Atlanta, I sold all my strength equipment, everything like that. And all I had was some strength bands, some resistance bands. And so I set a goal. I said, I would like to build some strength and I would like to gain 10 pounds of muscle. And my challenge is I'm going to only use resistance bands. I'm going to see if it works. And I documented the whole process, and in about 3.5, 4 months, I was able to achieve my goal. And it was just with resistance bands. A lot of people scoff at resistance bands, but they're one of my go-tos. So there are so many possibilities when it comes to strength training. We're not just limited to equipment. So I'm just curious, in the chat, let me know what type of strength training you do. And if you don't strength train, does any of these modalities kind of appeal to you a little bit? Let me know in the chat. I'd love to see. I'd love to see what might excite you a little bit, or what you might want to try, just based on some of these things that we talked about. Let me know. Seeing resistance bands and dumbbells, body weights, yes. Kettlebells, absolutely. Calisthenics, body weights, absolutely. Awesome. Free weights, resistance, a little bit of everything. Can never go wrong with that, absolutely. Everything discussed, that's awesome, that's great. Because now you're literally unlimited. You can do so many different things and challenge the body in so many different ways. Awesome, thank you all so much for your feedback. I love the interaction, this is great. Okay, so we've talked about the benefits, we've talked about different modalities, and that's great. But now let's take it the final step here, and let's talk about 3 general principles that if you apply, you can definitely start to see some results, okay? The first one is use whole body compound movements. Okay, when we talk about whole body, we're talking about getting everything into it. Now that doesn't mean that you have to, every exercise has to be full body all the time, no. But when you're talking about training through the week, for example, you want to make sure that the entire body is engaged. I like visuals, you know that. So let me give you a visual of a car. If all you do is put gas in the car, but you don't do anything else, you never check the oil, you never check the tires, you never deal with that check engine light that everybody has every once in a while, and you just ignore it until something starts smoking, right? Like, obviously, you're getting gas, that's great, but the other parts of the system aren't being maintained. So we're not at optimal level. And it's kind of the same thing when we're looking at trying to get results from our strength training efforts. We want to make sure that all systems are in check. And so a really easy way to do that is to focus on something called primal patterns. Primal patterns. There are 6 listed here: a squat, a hinge, which is pretty much hip movement, posterior chain, or the back part of the body, lunging, pressing, pulling, and rotating. Now, these pictures are just kind of supposed to be samples, but remember, every exercise can be modified. You can make something more difficult or something easier. So the squat, for example, shows me with a barbell. That doesn't mean you have to use a barbell. You could use one of the modalities that we just talked about. You could make it as simple as working on standing up out of a chair. Or you could load up a barbell with a lot of weight and lift heavy. So all of these are options, but that's number 1, is compound movements, full body. Number 2, something called progressive overload. Now, again, I could talk all day about these principles and dive in, and I do in some of my lectures, but today I'm going to keep it very simple. I'm going to give you a visual. Nice beach, beautiful. It'd be nice to be on a beach right now. You build a sandcastle, all right? You build a nice sandcastle. Tide comes in and knocks it down. So what do you do to prevent that from happening again, or at least the tide from really disturbing your sandcastle? So you could walk away, you could quit, or you build it bigger, stronger, so that the waves don't impact it as much. And that's a very simplistic example of what progressive overload is the body will respond to the stress of exercise. So you exercise, your body's stressed, it's broken down slightly. Well, the body will bounce back, but it tries to bounce back stronger, much like the sand example, the sandcastle example. You continually need to challenge the body so that your body continues to progress. If you stay the same and never change the challenge, it's like that wave. It's going to continue to knock sandcastle, and you're not going to see much improvement. And how do we do that? How do we make these improvements? By focusing on manipulating something called variables. Variables are just the components of any type of exercise. So that could be performing more repetitions than you did previously. That could be performing more sets, more groups of repetitions. That's called increased volume. Or you could add load. In other words, you lift heavier weights next time. Or you could decrease the rest or increase the rest based on what you're trying to accomplish. And then that all plays into something called intensity, right? So you can have low or high intensity, and manipulating these variables will challenge how your body responds. And that's what contributes to progressive overload. So we want to progressively overload to get results. Third, specificity. Specificity. What that means simply is do what you're trying to accomplish. For example, if I want to be a better swimmer, if all I do is do bicep curls, am I going to be a better swimmer? Probably not. It may help, but it's not going to be a direct correlation to swimming. I need to swim. So when it comes to strength training, if you have a very specific outcome in mind or a goal in mind, you want to train that way. And this is just a basic continuum of strength training. We have power on one end, which typically means really heavy weight, longer rest, very few repetitions because it's very heavy. And then as you move along that continuum through strength, hypertrophy, which means muscle building, and endurance, typically it switches. So we have higher repetitions and lower load or lower weight. And depending on your goals, you'll fall along this continuum. And so the big takeaway here is train specific. Kind of know what you're aiming for and then set it up so that you're training for that outcome. A lot of information, so I'm going to give you a couple final thoughts and then we can open it up for some questions. A couple final thoughts that just being in the field for so long, I think these are some great takeaways. Number one, you always have to kind of balance the risk versus effectiveness. Some things look really cool. I know I watch, the CrossFit games and I'm like, oh man, I want to do that. That looks so much fun. And if I want to, I need to make sure that I work up to that I can prepare myself to take on that challenge, because sometimes things are very risky, whether it's from an injury standpoint or just from a physiological load standpoint. So you got to weigh that risk versus effectiveness. Is it really going to help me get the results I want? For example, if your goal is to lose weight and you have the choice of doing like something like slam balls, heavy slam balls, which you take a heavy ball and just slam it over and over again, or something like a snatch, which is a Olympic lift where you pull a barbell over your head. Both are awesome. But if you're just getting started, it's easier to do the med ball slams for your goal, because an Olympic lift, like a snatch, is a skill movement. It takes a lot of time to master. So risk versus effectiveness, the slam balls would be the best because you're going to burn a lot of calories in a short amount of time and it takes almost no skill. So that you're going to want to have to weigh those when you're thinking about that. Number two, experiment. Have fun. This needs to be enjoyable and it needs to be fun. So experiment. I gave you a lot of ideas for modalities. Try them. That's how you learn what you like and what you don't like. Number three, of course, set goals. Have an idea of what you would like to accomplish and go after it. Set a plan in motion and go after it. And then, of course, the last but not least, these are all great things. And if you have the will to do this on your own, awesome. But there's no shame in seeking qualified help, okay? There are highly qualified people that are willing and able to help you out and get you on the path and hopefully educate you so that you can do this on your own, empower you to do this on your own. All right, so those are some quick final thoughts, some quick takeaways. And from there, I would love to thank you for your time in this. And of course, I'd love to open it up for any questions or comments that you may have.
Thank you, Pete, for the great lecture. Everyone just feel free to put your questions in the chat box and we can get them to Pete for him to answer them. So I guess I have one right off the bat. How would you suggest someone that wants to say like exercise outside, where should they go? What should they be looking for? And like, what are some tips for exercising outside?
That's a great question. Like I said earlier, I'm a huge fan of you're only limited by your creativity. So if there are playground equipment or very sturdy tree limbs, I mean, really you could get away with any of that. Because again, when you're talking about body weight exercises, you don't really need anything When you're talking about some of more of the pull complexes that we've talked about, you're obviously going to need something sturdy. And so when you're talking about outside, a pull-up bar would be awesome. Or like I said, a playground. Most playgrounds have monkey bars. As long as you're not pushing kids out of the way, okay? Got to share the playgrounds. But that would be a great place to start. Anything that is solid and safe, obviously. But when we're talking about outdoor training, a lot of times you can use the things around you. If you want to add resistance, you can utilize branches, sticks, rocks. Again, there's a risk level for sure. But if we're looking at trying to do things without, purchasing things, you use the environment around you. The second tip I would give you when you're talking about outside training or body weight training is use your body as resistance. So for example, if I'm doing pull-ups, I can do pull-ups and maybe I can build up so I can do 100 pull-ups. Well, that's awesome. And I'm definitely building some strength, but I'm building more endurance. How do I challenge that musculature with just my body? Well, one of the easiest ways to do that is to change angles. And you start to create some mechanical disadvantages, it's my biomechanical term, where it will challenge the tissue differently. Just to give you a visual here, if I'm doing pull-ups, I can do something called a lever pull-up, where instead of just a straight pull-up, I can try to keep my arms straight and pull myself up. Still working similar muscles, but now the load and the angle of load has changed significantly. And now you're able to challenge yourself on a whole nother level. And that would be my second tip, is to try different body positions. If you're doing body squats, do a squat, then progress to a supported pistol squat. What a pistol squat is just a single leg squat, right? From there, you can do unstable squats. So you're standing on something like a balance beam, something like that, where you're continually challenging the system. So those are some quick takeaways if you want to start doing some outdoor training or some body weight training without having to invest in equipment. Great question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That definitely helps for anyone wanting to get outside. So we have another question. Of the variables you listed, where do you prefer to start when progressing an exercise?
That's a really good question. Training level or training status plays a role in that. What I mean by that is if someone has been training for a long time and they've got what we call a history of resistance training, which would mean that they're intermediate or more advanced, typically you have more freedom with the variables. And that's when you can really throw some challenge. If we're talking about a beginner, I always start with volume. What I mean by that is repetitions. I always start with repetitions over load because I'm a huge fan of mastering movement patterns and making sure that if we're going to load a pattern, that we're loading it appropriately, right? Everyone wants to lift heavy weights, not everybody, but a lot of people want to. And it's so easy to just jump under a big heavy squat rack. But if we're not moving the right way, we're not developing the right way. So if I'm working with a beginner, I always start with volume. So we're talking about repetitions and then adding sets and then even rest, decreasing or increasing rest time to really challenge the system and building that endurance. Because when you build endurance, that'll allow you to take those steps towards strength and things like that much easier. Now, if you're more intermediate or advanced, then we have a little more room to play. So it may be load, it may be variables I didn't talk about, such as eccentric or concentric time. What that means is how the tempo. So do I push up really fast and come down really slow? That changes how the body responds. So all of those are variables that you can mess with, but it kind of, to answer your questions based on your level, beginner, I would always stick with volume. So repetitions, sets, and then rest. And if you're more intermediate advanced, then you have a little more freedom with load and different types of variables there. Great question.
Yeah, thank you for answering that. So we have two more questions in the chat box.
Awesome.
The first one coming from, are there any movements that older people should avoid for strength training? For example, this person is a 63-year-old female.
Okay, yeah, that's a really good question. Of course, that goes back to that risk versus effectiveness thing. And you have to really look at a bigger picture versus just an exercise. Because I know that there are that people call contraindicated exercise, meaning they are not recommended. And I think that word should be applied on a much bigger spectrum. You can't really label an exercise as good or bad. It's good or bad for an individual based on a lot of mitigating factors, right? So Again, my first suggestion is, of course, getting an assessment, working with a qualified professional who understands movement, and then, of course, having that history. Do you have a history of certain joint problems? Are you dealing with any diseases that could be contraindicated? Because that would come into play with what you should and should not do. For example, I mean, just someone who has really, really bad knees or had 2 knee replacements, does that mean they shouldn't squat? No, but do we need to modify their squat? Yeah, possibly. And so it's hard to say, yes, avoid this, or no, don't avoid, don't do this, yes, do that, because I think it's based on a lot of things. The 2 things that, other than the history and pre-existing conditions, is also mobility. So if somebody has poor mobility, it will limit the capacity of that exercise. What we mean by mobility, and that's a whole nother lecture, that's something else I could talk about, but the ability for a joint to go through a range of motion under control and have control of that movement, right? Not just passively, but actively. So, being able to raise my arm up. If I can't raise my arm up past my head, doing an overhead loaded pattern probably isn't great. So we would want to modify that based on that individual. For example, if someone has really, really tight hips or back pain, do we do a heavy loaded squat as deep as possible? Probably not. But I am a big advocate for trying to improve functional range of motion, which means an unloaded pattern that trying to get to the absolute best range of motion for each individual. So someone has 2 knee replacements and a bad back, do we work to help them have a body squat that is at a great depth for them? Yes. And there are things that we can do to mitigate issues. So if you have knee problems, again, there are some things that we can do to change your pattern, change your foot position, change the depth at which you go. So you can still squat, but it's going to be based on you. And so I'm not trying to, I wish I could say, yes, this is good, yes, this is bad, but I think there's so many things that mitigate that. But I would definitely say, this would be my takeaway to answer your question, be conservative first, meaning start with no load or very little load. Start with ranges of motion or patterns that are not full range of motion or not forced range of motion. What I mean by that is, if you're going to squat, do a body weight squat, go as to the depth that you feel comfortable. Don't force it. From there, we can evaluate, a professional can evaluate your pattern and give you tips on how to improve that. And if that's the depth that you can go because there are some things preventing you, then we can make the best of what you got. Just a quick example, I've had 8 knee surgeries on my right knee, not proud of it. And I was told by my orthopedic surgeon at 25 years old that I needed a knee replacement. It's not a good statistic to have, but I was the youngest candidate in Kansas at the time to qualify for a knee replacement, which that's not a good thing to be proud of, everybody. I'm just telling you. So I made some pretty poor decisions growing up with my athletic career, and told me I need to have a desk job. But I refused to just comply to that, and I did the best I could, and now I'm able to squat and move and stay functional. Of course, there's modifications, but I'm able to still do those things because I've been able to modify them. So to answer your question, start conservative, do what feels right, and then of course work on the things that you can so that we can optimize your patterns that fit you. Great question.
Thank you, Pete. That was a really good answer to that. And then we have one more question in the chat box saying, how do you teach your students to work on that creativity and not limit themselves to exercises everyone does at the gym?
That's a great question. If I'm talking to my students, the first thing that I always say is, you have to understand what you're talking about before you can do it. And that means taking some time to invest in the basic physiology, the basic anatomy, the basic biomechanics of human movement. That's why, again, I'm talking to my students, it's exercise science, right? It's not just a list of exercises, it's understanding the physiological impact to movement and understanding that the smallest change triggers a physiological change. So taking some time, and again, this is not just for students. I mean, just having a general idea of what muscle you're working and what the pattern does to improve it can take you so much further. So I always start with understanding just a basic foundation. That's number one, because then you know what you're challenging. So you know that when you do a bench press, for example, it's not just a chest muscle that you're working. You're working triceps, you're working deltoids. You're also working the backside, which are called the antagonists during that. So you're working your lats, you're working your traps because they're supporting the movement. It's understanding those concepts, and that allows you to have some freedom and be creative, because now I know, all right, well, all of these muscles are engaged. So what if I change my hand pattern or my hand placement? What if I go a different path? So I come up higher and come down low. Or what if I put one hand higher, one hand lower in bench press? What does that do? You're able to start being creative because you're understanding how the muscles are physiologically responding to those changes. So there's my little plug for investing in your education. But the second one is a little bit more on the kind of the courage side. And the courage side is to take that step and try something that you're not used to. That's outside your comfort zone. Of course, always maintaining safety. But I think when we're talking about a gym setting, I mean, I grew up in the gym, everybody. I mean, I know there's a lot of things going on at the gym, and putting yourself out there is one of the hardest things to do. It's intimidating anyway, but to do something different or challenging and then to possibly fail or look ridiculous comes with consequences. And so I would say, if you want to try things or work on that creativity, you have to have the courage to start trying things that go beyond your comfort zone and be okay with it not going well. I can't tell you how many times I've tried exercises or I've experimented with patterns and I've fallen or I tip or I look ridiculous, but I know what I'm doing is I'm trying to develop my arsenal of exercises and modalities for improvement. And so for me, that's my confidence. So people can giggle or, scoff all they want. For me, it was, I'm trying to improve my approach to helping people. And if you can grasp that, then you can start experimenting, start being creative, start trying things that are outside your comfort zone. That's the first step to growth, right? We all know that if you don't cultivate something you plant, it doesn't grow, right? You have all this knowledge, but if you don't put it to the test and you don't try it or try to cultivate it, it's just going to stay stagnant. You have to invest in it. And that means sometimes doing some things that you may not be comfortable with. So that'd be my professor advice on improving that creative aspect. So understand what you're talking about from an education standpoint, from an anatomy standpoint, but then also kind of build that courage and that confidence to start challenging yourself to do things that are outside your comfort zone. And then of course, take note on it. Like what worked, what didn't work, what did you notice? How could this be used? That's what's going to help you develop those skills. So great question. Thank you.
That's definitely some great advice there, and something we could all learn from and practice in our own strength training routine. But we don't have any more questions in the chat box. So thank you, Pete, so much for sharing your knowledge with us. Everyone, please check him out on his moreToMovement.com website and follow him on Instagram. He has an awesome podcast that anyone, even if you have a background in exercise science or not, anyone can understand it. So definitely check it out. So thank you, Pete, for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. And I'm always here to help you. If you have questions, concerns, please reach out. Be happy to chat with you about any of this stuff. So again, thanks for the opportunity, and best of luck to all of you. Thank you.